The Ukrainians are holding on still to a little bit of a sliver, about 15 kilometers wide, of southern Kursk region. They've been pushed out of the main area of Suicidal, so they've lost the enclave, which they did have from last August, but they've been able to get out. There's been a bit of a scramble over the weekend. They've lost some men, they've certainly lost some equipment, but they certainly have not been surrounded, so they're now moving back onto their own side of the border. In effect, the Kursk operation is now finished.
Russian military forces are completing the rout of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk border area, President Vladimir Putin said at an expanded meeting of the Prosecutor General's office board. In quotations, "Our troops recently carried out a series of rapid, rather daring, effective operations and are completing the defeat of the enemy's troop group in the Kursk region," he said. Specifically, it is reported that the units of the North Group have driven the Ukrainians out of Suicidal. Very soon, the Kursk border area will be completely liberated, reports Russian sources. Whether our military will stop at the border or move on is an open question. Perhaps the paratroopers' forays into the Sumy region will turn into preparation of a bridgehead for the formation of a full-fledged buffer zone, said a Russian commander in RIA Novosti. But according to some of the more objective pro-Ukrainian reporters like Yuri Butusov, the idea of a Russian offensive into the Sumy region is a bit too early to speak about, he claims. Ukrainian troops are building a defensive line along the dominant heights in the territory of the Russian Federation, wrote Yuri Butusov, editor-in-chief of Censor.net. The Russian enemy, he says, continues to attack Ukrainian positions near the settlements of Oleshnie and Revo in the Kursk region. In quotations, "Heavy fighting is underway. The Russian enemy continues to maintain a significant advantage in the number of infantry and drones, in the number of air and missile strikes, but the defense of the Ukrainian troops has significantly strengthened after the withdrawal from Suicidal. The front line has been shortened. Our firepower and drones can again work effectively, since the Russian enemy can no longer control our battle formations to the full depth," he emphasized. But the most illuminating report on the Kursk debacle comes from the UK's BBC.
Лишь свистят пули, враг бьет из гранатомета.
A raw and gripping account of the suicidal retreat from the Kursk region by the Ukrainian armed forces. The withdrawal under heavy fire from Russian forces was described as being like the scenes from a horror movie, based on extensive accounts from Ukrainian troops who spoke to the BBC. So I decided, my friends, I will give one last report on the Kursk collapse, even though the battle is more or less over. We will hear primarily from three sources, the BBC in the West, and then from two Ukrainian experts, Yuri Butusov and Sergei Gurets, on what's currently happening and what's likely to occur next after Kursk. But before we begin, I ask that you help keep this show running by super thanks or PayPal donations, and most of all, to consider joining the channel membership. This is where I post weekly exclusive analysis, graphic combat footage, and breaking news that is not shown in the mainstream media. Watch the trailer video in the end screen and stick around for some bonus combat footage towards the end. Now let's get into it. BBC reports that Ukrainian servicemen recount a catastrophic withdrawal in the face of heavy fire and columns of military equipment destroyed and constant attacks from swarms of Russian drones. The soldiers who spoke over social media were given aliases to protect their identity. Some gave accounts of a collapse as Ukraine lost Suicidal, the largest town it held. Ukrainian restrictions on travel to the front have meant that it is not possible to get a full picture of the situation. But this is how 5 Ukrainian soldiers described to the BBC what happened. On March 9th, Vladimir sent a telegram post to the BBC saying that he was still stuck in Suicidal, where there was panic and collapse of the front. Ukrainian troops are trying to leave, columns of troops and equipment. Some of them are burned by Russian drones on the road. It is impossible to leave during the day. Movement of men, logistics and equipment have been reliant on one major route between Suicidal and Ukraine's Sumy region. Vladimir said it was possible to travel on that road relatively safely a month ago. By 9th of March, it was all under the fire control of the Russian enemy. Drones around the clock. In 1 minute, you can see 2 to 3 drones. That's a lot, he said. We have all the logistics here on one Suja-Sumy highway, and everyone knew that the Russians would try to cut it. But this again came as a surprise to our command. At the time of writing, just before Russia retook Suja, Vladimir said Ukrainian forces were being pressed from 3 sides. By the 11th of March, Ukrainian forces were battling to prevent the road being cut, according to telegram messages from Maxim. A few days ago, we received an order to leave the defense lines in an organized retreat, he said, adding that Russia had amassed a significant force to retake the town, including large numbers of North Korean soldiers. Military experts estimate Russia had amassed a force of up to 70,000 troops to retake Kursk. Russia had also sent its best drone units to the front and was using kamikaze and first-person view variants to take fire control of the main logistics routes. They included drones linked to operators by fiber optic wires, which are impossible to jam with electronic countermeasures. Maxim said as a result, the Russian enemy managed to destroy dozens of units of equipment, and that wrecks had created congestion on supply routes. The situation on that day, the 11th of March, was described as catastrophic by Anton. The third soldier spoken to by the BBC was serving in the headquarters for the Kursk front. He too highlighted the damage caused by Russian FPV drones. We used to have an advantage in drones. Now we do not, he said. He added that Russia had an advantage with more accurate airstrikes and a greater number of troops. Anton said supply routes had been cut, logistics no longer work, organized deliveries of weapons, ammunition, food and water are no longer possible. Anton said he managed to leave Suja by foot at night. He almost died several times. Drones are in the sky all the time. The soldier predicted Ukraine's entire foothold in Kursk would be lost, but that, from a military point of view, the Kursk direction has exhausted itself. There is no point in keeping it anymore. Western officials estimate that Ukraine's Kursk offensive involved about 12,000 troops. They were some of their best trained soldiers, equipped with Western-supplied weapons, including tanks and armored vehicles. And of course we know that this estimate of a mere 12,000 Ukrainian troops in Kursk is a gross underestimation by the West. Russian bloggers published videos showing some of that equipment being destroyed or captured. On the 13th of March, Russia said that the situation in Kursk was fully under their control and that Ukraine had abandoned much of its material. In social media posts on the 11th to 12th of March, a fourth soldier by the name of Dmitry likened the retreat from the front to a scene from a horror movie. The roads, he said, are littered with hundreds of destroyed cars, armored vehicles and ATVs, which are all-terrain vehicles. There are, he said, a lot of wounded and dead. Vehicles were often hunted by multiple drones, he said. He described his own narrow escape when the car he was traveling in got bogged down. He and his fellow soldiers were trying to push the vehicle free when they were targeted by another FPV drone. It missed the vehicle but injured one of its comrades. He said they had to hide in a forest for 2 hours before they were rescued. Dmitry said many Ukrainians retreated on foot, with guys walking 15 to 20 kilometers. The situation, he said, had turned from difficult and critical to catastrophic. In a message on the 14th of March, Dmitry added, "Everything is finished in the Kursk region. The operation was not successful." He estimated that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers had died since the first crossing into Russia in August. Now, a fifth soldier sounded less gloomy about the situation. On the 13th of March, Artem sent a telegram message from a military hospital where he was being treated for shrapnel wounds suffered in a drone attack. Artem said he had been fighting further west near the village of Loknia, where Ukrainian forces were putting up a stiff resistance and fighting like lions. He believed the operation had achieved some success. It's important that so far the armed forces of Ukraine have created this buffer zone, thanks to which the Russians cannot enter Sumy, he said. Ukraine's top general, Alexander Syrsky, insists that Ukrainian forces have pulled back to more favorable positions, remain in Kursk, and will do so for as long it is expedient and necessary. He said Russia had suffered more than 50,000 losses during the operation, including those killed, injured, or captured. However, the situation is now very different to last August. Military analysts estimate 2/3 of the 1,000 square kilometer gained at the outset have since been lost. Any hopes that Ukraine would be able to trade Kursk territory for some of its own have significantly diminished or completely vanished. Last week, President Volodymyr Zelensky said he believed the Kursk operation had accomplished its task by forcing Russia to pull troops from the east and relieve pressure on Kursk. But, the BBC reports, it is not yet clear at what cost. So now, my friends, we try to answer the question, what are the prospects for a Russian offensive into the Sumy Oblast, as was hinted by in Russian media RIA Novosti in the opening scenes of this video?
Командир берет автомат рядового и ведет штурмовиков за собой.
So what we will do is take a look at two perspectives from two Ukrainian analysts that they shared since the 17th of March. In quotations, despite the withdrawal of our Ukrainian units and brigades from positions in the Kursk region, the Kursk operation is still ongoing, writes Ukrainian military analyst Sergei Gurets. We know that sections of Russians' territory are being held, where the Russians continue to attempt their offensive actions, using initiative to the west and east of the road leading to Sumy. There are attempts to break through with assault actions into Ukrainian territory to threaten our logistics. However, the situation is now becoming mirrored for the Russians, he claims, meaning these logistics restrictions are now a limitation for Russian forces. According to him, Ukraine is transitioning to a defense format using shorter logistics for Ukrainian troops. Additionally, by holding the dominant heights near the state border, the Russian advance into Ukrainian territory will be greatly complicated, despite claims that the Russian army is creating a threat for an offensive on Sumy. In quotations, so far, I don't see any preconditions for a Russian offensive on Sumy because Russian troops are exhausted and our logistics are shorter to supply the units that have withdrawn on a holding defense there. Additionally, we have our fortifications that were built earlier. As for Russian reserves in this area, I do not know for sure yet, but there is one Russian unit that was deployed to this area and hasn't been engaged in combat yet. Perhaps it will be involved in some offensive actions. However, I repeat, logistics, geography, and the current situation do not give Russia any significant advantage to advance towards the Sumy region, concluded Mr. Gurets.
Пробил насквозь. Соответственно, пассажира
And Mr. Yuri Butusov seems to share a somewhat similar position.
уничтожил.
Для этих атак в Курской области противник не пожалел.
The Russian command, as the prisoners report, has set a task to capture the entire territory of the Ukrainian sanitary zone in Kursk during these last 10 days of March, he says. Therefore, the attacks will intensify, and now the Russians are regrouping to launch an offensive simultaneously along the entire front in Kursk. According to Butusov, the Russians have not made any deep advances into the territory of Ukraine at the moment. Several small groups of infantry entered up to 3 kilometers into the territory of Ukraine near the village of Basivka and Novenkoye. The advance has been stopped, he says. The Russian enemy has been hit with precise strikes, and they are not currently building up forces, he writes. In quotations, the Ukrainian command is conducting active maneuver defense. The troops are provided with ammunition. The management and interoperability of UAV units are gradually improving. Every effort is being made to maintain the important operational line on the border. The city of Sumy is not threatened by a ground offensive in the near future. There are enough of our combat-ready troops in the area, Butusov summarizes. Subsequently, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine published a map of fighting in Kursk, which indicates that the defense forces are currently outside of Sucha.
Straight down this corridor here. This corridor here.
Yeah.
Boom, straight down, okay?
Covering fire. Go.
Good, yes.